Welcome back to Western Civilization 1. This is Dr. Young, your instructor. When we last left off, we were talking about the late Roman Republic, and specifically had begun to talk about what happened during the Second Triumvirate. Mentioned that Octavian and Marcus Antonius and Lepidus had been proclaimed the Triumvirate by the Roman government and had been given rule over all of the provincial regions of Rome, which gave them the opportunity to extend their power even further. Antonius, who was probably the prime member of the First Triumvirate, the one sitting in the best position, the most powerful, as it were, chose to go to the east and take charge of the Roman provinces in Macedonia and what the Romans called Asia, what we would refer to as Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey, and also the Levant region over here. Now, let's remember that Egypt down here was not part of Rome yet. Rome had not conquered Egypt. It was still being ruled by the Ptolemaic rulers, the last remnants of the kingdom begun with the conquest of Alexander the Great. So Antonius went over here to Asia, and for a time he tried to fight a war against the Parthians, tried to kind of raise troops and money and things like this, and he ran into some difficulties there. And he sent an appeal to Alexandria, to Cleopatra, who, let's remember, was aided by Julius Caesar during his time in Egypt, and had fathered, or Julius Caesar had fathered a child by Cleopatra, whose name was Caesarion, and so she had this experience with Romans previously, so she was thought of as an ally. Here's Antonius, who thought of himself as the heir of Julius Caesar. He reached out to Cleopatra, and Cleopatra invited him to come down to Alexandria and to, I guess, engage in some sort of talks about how they could form a partnership. And if you know what really happened, it seems that Cleopatra intended the entire time to seduce him, which is exactly what happened. Antonius and Cleopatra ended up in a long relationship with each other, and this was somewhat problematic for Antonius in the eyes of the Romans, who saw Cleopatra as a foreigner. Antony, in order to cement the relationship with Octavian, had married Octavian's sister, but had left her in Italy when he went off to the east, and now he was off sort of cavorting with this Egyptian queen, and this did not sit very well with many of the Romans, particularly because of what Octavian did during this time. Octavian had technically rule over Gaul and Hispania and these places up here, but he never really left Rome. Unlike Antonius, who went to the east, or Lepidus, who went down here to North Africa, Octavian stayed in Rome, and he used his proximity to the capital as a way of, maintaining keeping his finger on the pulse of the Roman people. Octavian goes down in history as one of the most powerful men, one of the most successful rulers, but he did this not on the basis that many other rulers have maintained their power. Octavian was never a brilliant military strategist. In fact, in the wars that he fought, he relied very heavily on others. Early in the partnership between him and Antonius, he relied on Antonius really to do the military thing, and Octavian, although he commanded troops, was did not excel at military things. Nor was he a terribly imposing figure. Octavian had been a fairly sickly and weak youth. He was not very not very large, not very muscular. Even the statues that kind of make him larger than life later on do not completely cover over the fact that he was not the most imposing physical figure. He doesn't even seem to have been that brilliant an orator. What Octavian was able to do extremely well, and this is really the secret to his success, was to manipulate public opinion. He was a brilliant propagandist, and he had good material from his rivals. Once he learned that Antonius was engaged in a sexual liaison with Cleopatra, he made that public. He spread the news, and he twisted the meaning of it. He made it sound like Antonius was completely bewitched by Cleopatra, that she was a sorceress, that she intended to use him to conquer Rome and set herself up as the empress. Let's remember that Romans still had a great abhorrence of monarchy, and the East was steeped in traditions of not only kings, but even divine rulers in Egypt, and this is the sort of thing that the Romans would have found highly problematic. And so Octavian made it seem like Cleopatra was the great threat here, right? And Antonius was mostly oblivious to this, it seems. Even though he had allies in the Senate, he was off in Egypt and was busy with Cleopatra and ended up fathering a couple of children with her, really wasn't paying attention. And Octavian had the ear of the Roman public. Now, at one point, Octavian became so bold and so confident in the hold he had on the public opinion that he sent soldiers down to North Africa and placed Lepidus under house arrest, effectively removing him from power and taking over the lands that he controlled. And it was about this point that Antonius finally figured out what was going on. But by that point, Octavian had mustered together a massive army and navy and was ready to move on the lands that Antonius controlled. Antonius also put together a military and tried to cut him off before he reached Greece. This came to a battle. You can see the crossed swords here. Really, it should be a boat, because this was mostly a naval battle off of the coast of the western coast of the Greek lands here. This was in the year 31 BCE, and the result of that battle was that Octavian was victorious. And, you know, I mean, that's the long and short of it. We could go into detail about the battle, but that's not really a fitting subject for this class. In any case, Octavian was victorious. Militarily, he relied very heavily on his key military advisor, whose name was Agrippa. After the battle, Antony and Cleopatra fled, went back down to Alexandria, and ultimately committed suicide together before they could be taken prisoner by Octavian. There are kind of some funny stories about this, or they can be spun in a funny way. In any case, it seems that Cleopatra was extremely paranoid. I mean, we may have these kind of romantic notions of Antony and Cleopatra that are fed by Shakespeare and his tragedy about them and everything. But from historical accounts, we at least have a sense that Cleopatra was extremely paranoid and locked herself in her own bedchamber and wouldn't let anybody in, including Antony. And Antony wanted to go in and commit suicide with her, kind of the last romantic feat, as it were. But she wouldn't even let him in. And so he ran himself through with a sword, and then he got his men to hoist him up over her balcony with ropes. And apparently, you know, so you have to envision this guy bleeding out. And they're hoisting him, and probably with every hoist he's screaming in pain, just so he can be in the presence of his lover. And in any case, they ended up dying together there. We don't know really what the truth is. That may be embellished as well. But long and short of it is that Antony and Cleopatra were now out of the way, and Octavian was able to take charge of Egypt. Not only did he have power in all of the lands that Rome controlled at this point, although there were a few others who were potential rivals to Octavian. There's more to the war after this, but we don't need to go into those details. Shortly after this, he was the master of all of the Roman lands. Okay. Now, Octavian would become Augustus Caesar, and this lecture, this video, is devoted almost entirely to Augustus and to his accomplishments, to the empire he created. And in the next video, we'll go into some detail about the empire, roughly 3 centuries or so of empire that lasted after Augustus. But I want to give a fairly detailed account of why he was so successful, what went into that. Octavian ruled over Rome from the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE to his death in 14 CE. So we're talking about 45 years of him being the dominant person in Rome. Okay. Now, the way that he succeeded in maintaining the lion's share of power was largely to do exactly what Julius Caesar had not done. Let's recall that Julius Caesar returned to Rome after defeating Pompey and proclaimed himself dictator for life, made moves to set up a hereditary monarchy, seemed to be headed in that direction. Octavian learned from that. Even if he wasn't as forceful as Julius Caesar or as bold and daring as Marcus Antonius, if he lacked some of the charisma and physical, simply the imposing physical figure of some of his contemporaries and some other figures in Roman history, he knew how to manipulate the political system. He knew where to lay claim to his power in ways that would appear non-threatening to the Senate, to the army, to the Roman public. And his longevity was a big key to this. The fact that he was in power for 45 years made it so people simply grew accustomed to being ruled by Octavian. It wasn't that they, just did an about-face and said, oh, we're so happy to have a monarch. It was that they got used to it, and like 2 full generations passed with Octavian or Augustus in charge. And by the time he left, or by the time he died, they were just used to the government working that way. And so most people insisted that his successor simply continue to do the same things that he had done, and there was little appetite. There was some, but not enough. Little appetite to go back to the Roman Republican system. Let's remember that by the time Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, that was almost exactly 100 years from the assassination of Tiberius Gracchus, which meant that Roman politicians had been fighting with each other, sometimes in open hostilities and civil war, for 100 years. And people were sick of this, it seems. They wanted stability, and Augustus provided that kind of stability. Well, how did he do this? He never proclaimed himself to be the emperor. That's one of the things that we must note. Even though he is hailed universally as the first Roman emperor, that was not a title, or rather, and that's complicated. There was a title, imperator, but it did not mean what what it came to be associated with. That is, emperor did not mean at the time supreme ruler of everything. Augustus never sort of portrayed himself that way. He set himself up always as the champion of traditional Roman values and the traditional Roman structures. In fact, he set himself up as the great champion of the Republic, the savior of the Republic, when in fact he was making fundamental changes to the way that the Roman government worked, and effectively rendering the Republic no longer existent. Okay, one of the best ways to put this is that Augustus kept the form of the Republic. That is, he kept some of the veneer, or the facade of the Republic in place, some of the key institutions of the Republic. There was still a Senate. There were still assemblies, although eventually they were kind of dissolved, or their role changed. Rome continued to elect consuls and praetors and tribunes and other magistrates. There were still traditional things like triumphs held for victorious commanders. There was still very much talk about honor and these other essential cultural features. So he kept the form or the facade of the Republic, but he changed the substance. He changed the way those things worked, the way they operated, the way, the role of the Senate, the role of the consuls. He even succeeded in altering the concept of honor and the way that honor was granted, the way that a person came to honor. And he did this by making himself completely indispensable to everything in Rome, to the politics, to the social organization, to the economy, to the culture. Everything sort of revolved around him. Okay. Now, how could he do something so bold and so daring? Well, a lot of it had to do with his control of resources. When he took charge of Egypt, after defeating Antony and Cleopatra, Augustus laid claim to Egypt as his own personal possession. And during his reign, he never relinquished that. He never turned this over to the Roman public to be public land. And let's remember that Egypt was, of all of the regions of the Mediterranean, in fact, all the regions of the Near East, the most productive agriculturally in the ancient world. It was still, the Nile was still flooding every single year predictably. It was still producing a tremendous amount of agricultural output, and it had other resources as well. And so Augustus effectively laid claim to that and could tax it and exploit it at his will. And all of the money that he got from that, from the taxation and exploitation of Egypt, went into his own personal bank account, his own personal coffers. And this would be like, to draw an analogy here, if somebody managed to conquer the United States, say. Heaven forbid, but I suppose, we can imagine that. There are plenty of apocalyptic or dystopian kinds of novels and books and video games and movies and things like this, so we can probably envision that. And the person who conquers, let's say it's the one responsible is a king or a dictator of some kind, says to the government he controls, okay, you can maintain all of the United States, but I am taking California as my own personal possession. And all of the things that California produces, the agriculture, the fruit and vegetable industry in particular, Silicon Valley, the Hollywood, all of the very lucrative industries that happen in California become the, kind of personal fief of a single person. Well, Egypt was the California of the Roman Empire. It was the most productive region by far. And Augustus was the one who benefited from that. Okay. And what this meant was that his personal fortune was exponentially larger than that of anyone else. Rome, let's remember, was a timocracy. It was ruled by the wealthy. People who served in government positions did so, with a tremendous outlay of their own funds. And with this outsized wealth, Augustus could do things that nobody else could. And I will talk about some of those things that he did as we go on here. Right. So the annexation of Egypt was huge because it meant that he had more money, more resources, by far, exponentially more than anyone else in the entire Roman Empire. Now, there was a lot of things that Augustus did in the aftermath of his victories that led to him having such outsized power. So the next bullet point here says control of the army. Okay, Augustus realized that, and I'm going to call him Augustus from now on. That was a title he received from the Senate and the people of Rome. It just means revered one. It's almost a token of being divine, though, and he did portray himself as divine, though not necessarily in the city of Rome itself. He certainly did in Egypt and in other places that were more accustomed to that. So, we'll refer to him as Augustus rather than Octavian from this point on. So Augustus recognized that the number of soldiers who were in arms was too many. There were too many of them. They were, Antony had client armies, he had client armies, there were other people in Rome who had client armies, and that this proliferation of client armies, in fact, had been the greatest source of instability over the last century of the Republic. And so he forcibly retired about half of those soldiers. Now, if we go by the numbers that the ancient sources give us, that's always a problematic venture. But there were, according to these sources, more than 500,000 soldiers in arms at the end of the Republic. And Augustus effectively said to them, you need to retire, or you're no longer a soldier. But he didn't just disband them. Because let's remember that one of the key political issues in the late Republic was what to do with military veterans. Rather, he took the money that he had, some of it, he had tremendous wealth, right? I mean, there's no way really of kind of putting this in modern terms. He was vastly more wealthy by comparison than, say, Bill Gates is today, right? Because of his control of Egypt, because of the inheritances he had received from Julius Caesar, and all of that. And he controlled a lot of land too. And so he took some of that land and he took some of that money, and he gave these military veterans land and money so they could settle down, so they could have a place of their own, they could farm, they could do whatever they wanted with that land, and people were pretty happy about this. I mean, this is exactly what soldiers wanted after serving in an army. And the army that was left was only about half the size of the previous one, but it was much more manageable. Augustus stationed the soldiers all throughout the provinces. Let's look at this map here. This is from somewhat later, because at the point of Augustus, Rome did not yet have control of Britannia, or what is now England. But you can see where the armies were stationed. Rome had, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, between 25 and 30 legions of soldiers. Each legion probably had 10,000 or more soldiers in it, so for a total of about 250,000 to 300,000 troops total. And you can see they're all stationed pretty much in the provinces, right? Up on the frontier. The Rhine River runs right here from the Swiss Alps down, meaning downhill, but north to the North Sea here. You have troops all along the Danube River here, which flows out of the Alps and over here into the Black Sea. And then troops over here in the Levant region on the border with the Parthian Empire down here, right? Well, according to the arrangement that Augustus made with the Senate and the army, he would be given governorship over all of the frontier provincial regions. And this meant that he not only controlled those lands, but he also controlled the army. This control of the army was key to his power and to his success. Now, having effectively taken control of the entire army, he still had the Senate to deal with, and there were still senators there who were not happy about him having such outsized power. There were still traditionalists in the Senate.
Rather than do what Sulla had done, and that is just eliminate his rivals by having them executed, and Augustus pretty much was magnanimous with people. He forgave people who opposed him. He did carry out some executions of people who were potential rivals to everything he had planned. And so he had the son of Julius Caesar by Cleopatra, Caesarion, executed. Also, the children of Antonius by Cleopatra were executed. And there were a few others who presented a kind of existential threat to him, who he simply could not leave around to bring some kind of rivalry his direction, right? But he was magnanimous with senators, and this put them at their ease. When he defeated Antonius, he was consul, and he had been consul for some years at that point. And he remained consul for another 4 or 5 years after Actium. But then in the year 27 BCE, so about 4 years after Actium, he made a big show of renouncing the consulship. He laid it down. He said, I'm no longer going to be consul. This is out of keeping with the traditions of our ancestors. One man should not have so much power. And this was a really disarming gesture. The senators seemed to have kind of warmed, those who still thought that he had too much power kind of warmed to him, and and his supporters said, no, you have to be consul. You have to have imperium because nobody has resources like you. If we want to get something done, we have to have somebody in place to do that. And so Augustus then, he had a plan to all of this. He said, well, I don't want to be consul because that's the highest government office, but you can name me tribune. And it turned out that he kept the office of tribune for the rest of his life. Now, tribune, let's recall, was the highest plebeian magistrate office. It held imperium, which meant it could issue executive orders. It really had the same power as the consul. And Augustus remained the tribune for the rest of his life. Now, there were a couple of occasions where he became consul again. Usually the years he wanted to introduce his relatives into public life and kind of set them up in government positions, he would run for consulship and be named consul. I mean, nobody was going to oppose Augustus, but he would then lay it down again after a year or so of being in the office. So he had imperium, and he could do whatever he wanted in the government. Now, as a way of thanking him or rewarding him for his magnanimous gestures, he was appointed by the Senate to be the princeps senatus. Now, the word princeps just means first one or first citizen, and this was an old office in the Senate. It was given as a kind of honorary to a distinguished senator, usually a very old man, who was given the chance or given the opportunity to speak first and to set the agenda for the debates in the Senate. Okay. And so this meant that Augustus could manipulate the Senate in whatever direction he wanted. He was the one to speak first. He spoke in uninterrupted fashion. He set the agenda, and so he was able to push his own agenda in the Senate by virtue of having that office. Now, he took the term princeps and kind of made that his public persona, because princeps was just an honorary thing. Same with Augustus. These are the titles that he used in public because they were disarming. It looked like he was just holding these honorary offices but wasn't really seeking to have any great personal power or anything like that, when in effect he was the one making all of the important decisions. He did give the Senate responsibilities, but he also played them off against other groups in Rome. He elevated a lot of people who were of kind of high plebeian status, the group called the equestrians. That's not a term you necessarily need to know for this class, but he elevated some of them and put them into positions of responsibility, stripped away some of the powers of the senators, and he was very shrewd at manipulating the different groups. and making sure they were all loyal to him and on his side, while at the same time taking powers from them. Okay. And his public persona was in keeping with this. Augustus never built himself a gigantic palace in the middle of Rome like some of his successors would do. He did have some nice resorts outside of the city on the Italian coast and other places. But in the city, he lived in an apartment. It was an upscale apartment like many of the other senators lived in, but it was an apartment nevertheless. In fact, the house of Augustus, the Domus Augusti, is still partly intact and in Rome. It's a place you can visit. It's kind of a museum now. This was the center of a lot of activity during the reign of Augustus. Augustus, according to many accounts we have, then went out in public. He was accessible to people. He engaged people in conversation. He talked to them. And this enhanced his popularity with especially with the plebeians. He did not put on airs in the sense of like wearing grander clothing than anyone else. We can see here from the two statues of Augustus, which I believe both date from his reign, that he's portrayed not as somebody larger than life, not as somebody who is divine, but on the left image there, he is portrayed as a Roman commander. I think that he is, he is shown with some marks of divinity here. The suit of armor has references to mythology and everything, and so, to some who would have been discerning, this would have been a reference to, or he's sort of portraying himself as one of the great heroes of the mythological stories. But he looks like a Roman commander here, right? In the image on the right, he is dressed in the robes of the Roman high priest, which is an office he held for most of his reign. After the death of Lepidus, who had been the high priest, he became the Pontifex Maximus, as it was called, and he presided over the rituals by virtue of holding that office. So that's another thing that he controlled, were a lot of the religious rituals, the spectacle of worship and things like that. He also put into place a lot of public works. Remember, he has by far the largest fortune, and so he spent it on things to beautify the city of Rome. He built temples. He built practical things as well, like roads and aqueducts and cisterns and bridges and things that made people's lives easier, gave them access to fresh water, made it so they could transport goods more easily. He also provided a lot of entertainment for people. He, imported wild animals and staged wild beast hunts and, fights between gladiators and lions and things like that in Rome. The Colosseum was not built yet, the famous Flavian Amphitheater, as it's called, but there were performance spaces, and Augustus made sure to entertain the Roman public, and they absolutely loved him for it. He also instituted some welfare systems where he would provide free food, usually in the form of grain, for the population of Rome periodically. And so, all of these things enhanced his popularity and made it so people simply could not envision life without Augustus, without all of the things that he brought to the city of Rome, to the empire. And again, after 45 years, people were just used to that and insisted that the institutions that he had put in place continue. Now, Augustus did not have invariable success, it should be said. There were some things that gave him problems. One of these was he devoted a lot of resources to an attempted military conquest of the lands that the Romans called Germania. What is now Germany and parts of other countries, Denmark, the Netherlands, pretty much everything east of the Rhine River and north of the Danube. He sent several legions into those areas, and these legions were destroyed almost completely by the native inhabitants whom they were fighting against. That attempted succession, that great military conquest that Augustus could have added to his list of accomplishments, was never fully done. In fact, it failed miserably. He also set himself up, and part of this was through his office of Pontifex Maximus is the great sponsor, the great champion of traditional Roman values. He encouraged, for instance, Romans to have lots of children and to maintain close family relationships. He got involved in legislating marital fidelity. There were laws that he pushed through, decrees that he made that punished people for committing adultery and some of these other things. All of this was to, again, set himself up as the champion of the traditional republic and everything that it stood for. The problem was that Augustus had some scandalous family members, and some of the things that he did might even be considered scandalous. For one, he fell in love with the wife of one of his close advisors, a guy named Claudius, and the woman's name was Livia. And so, as the holder of the lion's share of the power in Rome, he convinced Claudius to divorce his wife so that he could marry her. And Claudius went along with this, and Augustus married Livia, and they lived together for the last 20 years, 20 maybe 30 years of his life. Livia actually outlived him by quite a bit. That's one thing that may have raised some eyebrows. Even more was the scandalous character of his daughter Julia from his first marriage. He had one daughter. All of his sons ended up dying quite young. And so Julia really was in many ways his hope. She had 3 sons, and these were groomed by Augustus to be his successor. Unfortunately, they died quite young as well. 2 of them did at least. The other one fell out of favor with Augustus, and he exiled that son. But Julia, after the death of her husband Agrippa, who had been Augustus's key military advisor, kind of went crazy, it seems, or this may just be the propaganda about her or something. But she ended up in a series of kind of high-profile affairs. There was an equivalent of the paparazzi in the days of Rome. There were lots of rumors spread and other things. Augustus was so damaged by Julia's reputation that he ended up exiling her as well, kicking her out of Rome, sending her off to an island in the Mediterranean, even cutting her off from most of the resources, most of the opulence that she had enjoyed throughout her life. And he later recalled her and married her to his stepson once his grandsons had died, because that would legitimate his stepson as his heir. But that didn't go well with Julia either. So, these things were trouble for him. And that brings us to the third problem that Augustus had, and that is the problem of succession. Augustus really had a hard time finding an heir. He had sons who died young. His grandsons also died young. He even for a time thought of making Agrippa his heir, but Agrippa was about his own age, maybe even a little older. And Agrippa died several years before Augustus did, and so this didn't work out. And so finally he had to go with his stepson. So this was the son of Claudius and Livia by their marriage, and he adopted him. He married him. I think he married him to Julia, which would have been a form of incest, but I guess they weren't related by blood. In any case, he tried to make him fully a member of the family, and Tiberius was a capable but somewhat dour young man, and once Augustus died, Tiberius took over, and he wasn't nearly so successful. I realize I have made a typo here. This should say Julio-Claudian dynasty. Sorry, this is a bit out of sorts here, but I'm going to go ahead and edit that. In any case, the Julio-Claudian dynasty is what followed Augustus Caesar. Julio for Julius, which was the kind of adopted name of Augustus. He was the son of Julius Caesar, and so the dynasty goes back to Julius Caesar. And then Claudian, because Claudius was really the blood father, the blood patriarch of all of the people who ruled in this dynasty. This, put simply, was not a cast of characters who were very commendable. Tiberius ruled for, over 20 years, but even still, he was not well liked in Rome. He certainly wasn't as capable as Augustus was. He got so sick of the kind of stonewalling that many of the senators gave him that he left the city and went to his pleasure resort in Capri, down the Italian coast, and tried to rule from there. And this didn't work out very well. And after Tiberius came Caligula, who, or Gaius as he was known, but Caligula was his nickname. It means baby boots, because when he was young he would show up at military camp with these special boots made for him, military boots made for this young child. But Caligula was most likely certifiably insane. At one point he tried to name his horse a consul. He did a lot of other scandalous things. He publicly humiliated a number of senators, and he was assassinated only a few years into his reign. Following him was Claudius, not the same Claudius, not the father of Tiberius, but a different Claudius, the nephew of Livia, or grandson of Livia, I guess. But in any case, Claudius was the most effective of all the Julio-Claudians, except for Augustus. But he had problems with his public image and things like that, and was much more interested in reading and writing books than he was in doing the act of governing. And anyway, there's a really interesting book series written by Robert Graves, the great English poet, called I, Claudius, and then Claudius the God. This was made into a TV series by the BBC back in the early 1980s, and it's definitely worth watching. It's one of the best representations of ancient Rome, I think, that's ever been made in the popular media. Following Claudius was Nero, and you may know that during Nero's reign the city caught fire and much of it was destroyed, and Nero seems to have not done enough to stop the fire from spreading. In fact, he may have been thrilled with the fire because it meant that he could rebuild the city in a way that he thought was fitting. And in fact, it was built on a much grander scale and beautified after that. But Nero also had a lot of intrigue inside of his own family, intrigue in the palace. His own mother tried to assassinate him, for instance. We could, tell some pretty salacious stories about Nero and his habits. But Nero committed suicide in the year 68 CE, and that was the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They didn't have any heirs left after that point. Now, I'm not going to go on with the narrative and talk about later dynasties at this point. I will do some of that in the next video lecture. Rather, I want to talk about a couple of other things. Specifically, I want to look at a text here to conclude this video. This text is called the Res Gestae. That means deeds done, or things done. This was written by Augustus Caesar right at the end of his life. This is his last and perhaps greatest act of propaganda. This is, kind of an account of his rule that he had written up and engraved on monuments in the city of Rome and all over the empire so that people would remember what he had done. And we get a sense of how he portrayed himself, how he was able to accomplish his agenda from reading this. And I don't want to read necessarily every single bullet point here, but I do want to point out a couple of them. This is a text that you may see on the midterm, may need to do some exposition of. So, it's important to read this and get a really good sense of it. He starts out the text by saying, in my 19th year, on my own initiative and at my own expense, I raised an army with which I set free the state, which was oppressed by the domination of a faction. Now, he's very careful not to give a lot of details here. This is something that had happened almost 60 years previously, and so it had passed out of memory for a lot of people. Only the really old people probably would have remembered the details of it. what he's talking about here is the aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar. The faction that he's noting is the conspirators, the people who assassinated his adoptive father. He doesn't mention them because he doesn't want to dredge up these memories for people. He doesn't want people to remember that he came to rule in, less than ideal circumstances. So he's vague when he needs to be vague, and he's very specific when he needs to be specific. Then he goes on to say, for that reason, the Senate enrolled me in its order by laudatory resolution, so he became a senator, very young, and he notes that he always refers to specific years, as Romans did, by noting who was serving as consul that year, and so he's not talking about the power he gained himself. He's talking about the consuls and all of these structures of the Republic. And then, it gave him the imperium, and then note in the next sentence, with me as propraetor, it ordered me. It is the Senate. He didn't do this himself. In other words, the Senate did it, and he responded and did his duty, right? Like a good Roman Republican would do. So it ordered me, together with the consuls, to take care lest any detriment befell the state, but the people made me consul in the same years when the consuls each perished in battle, and they made me a triumvir for the settling of the state. Now, he doesn't go into details there, doesn't say I was triumvir with Marcus Antonius and Lepidus, who I bested in a contest of wills. No, I mean, that's not something that he wants people to remember. He wants to portray himself, again, as the great champion of the Republic, who is just doing his duty whenever he is asked to do that by the Senate or by the consuls or by whoever happens to be holding these important offices, right? Now, one of the things the Romans most prized, and one of the things that brought greatest honor, was winning military victories. And so he reminds people that he won lots and lots of wars, both civil and foreign, on the earth and sea, in the whole wide world. He fought all over the place. He fought naval battles. He fought earth battles. And yet at the same time, he's also magnanimous. As victor, I spared all the citizens who sought pardon, and I even spared some of the foreign peoples, as long as I knew that they were not going to be a threat to us, right? And he notes here that he triumphed. That means he was awarded a triumph. This is the greatest honor that one could receive. A victorious military commander returning victorious from a battle and we've talked about this in an earlier lecture, given this parade through the city where everyone would shout his name and praise him. Twice he triumphed with an ovation, and 3 times I enjoyed a curule triumph, and 21 times I was named emperor. Emperor was a kind of laudatory honorific that victorious commanders were given. It did not, again, mean supreme ruler at this point. But then he says, when the Senate decreed more triumphs for me, I sat out from all of them. Now, the question arises, why would he sit out? And usually the response I get from students is, well, he wanted to be humble. Romans and humility don't really go together. Okay? It's not about humility, it's about maintaining the facade of the Republic. No victorious military commander in Roman history ever had an ungodly number of triumphs, right? He had 5 of them. That's more than anybody else. He has the record, so to speak, but we don't want to make this ridiculous. We don't want to make a triumph into something that is just awarded to me whenever I, get up in the morning or whatever, right? This needs to mean something, and it needs to look like the Republic is still in place. Now, more straightforward down here under number 5, when the dictatorship was offered to me, both in my presence and my absence by the people and Senate, when, in this year that people were consuls, I did not accept it. Now, why did they try to name him dictator? Well, there was a massive food shortage in the city, and there was a crisis point, and they needed somebody to take care of that, and so the Republican mechanism for that was to appoint a dictator, and we've seen this before. But let's remember that Augustus was very careful not to make it look like he was a monarch, and so he didn't want to accept the dictatorship. He did, however, as he says here, I did not evade the curatorship of grain in the height of the food shortage, which I so arranged that within a few days I freed the entire city from the present fear and danger by my own expense and administration. So, he took care of the food shortage, but he did not do so as dictator. All his way of making it look like he's not really holding power when he was, right? And he did not accept, as it says, the annual and perpetual consulates. They tried to make him consul for life. He refused that because it was out of keeping with the way the Republic functioned. We could sum this up with this phrase right here. I received no magistracy offered contrary to the customs of the ancestors. Right? In other words, I didn't act or hold office in a way that destroyed the Republic, that was out of sorts with what others had done in the Republic. Well, in truth, he did. Lots of things that no one had ever done before, things that effectively destroyed the Republic. But in this very skillful use of propaganda, he's still making it look like the Republic is functioning. What the Senate then wanted to accomplish through me, in other words, not what I wanted to do, but what the Senate wanted to do, I did through tribunician power, that is, through my power as a tribune, and 5 times on my own accord I both requested and received from the Senate a colleague in such power. So he wasn't the only tribune. He's like, okay, now somebody is a check on my power. We got to make sure that I'm not the only one who holds this power. Well, I don't think that colleague really had any kind of power. Augustus exercised it all, but he's trying to make it look like he is not doing anything out of sorts. Just a couple of other points. This number 15 down here, he gave people money. And this was big, and particularly military veterans. But there were times when he just opened up his coffers and gave out grants to people and, won their loyalty as a result of that. Lots of public works. He rebuilt the Capitol and the Theater of Pompey. He doubled the capacity of the Marcian Aqueduct, the thing that brought one of the eventually 19 aqueducts that Rome had that brought fresh water into the city. He completed the Forum of Julius and the Basilica, which he built there. He built roads, bridges, temples, all these things, and thus not only beautified the city of Rome and made it more accessible, made it easier to travel in, but he also provided a lot of jobs as a result of this. Here's the entertainment down here. 3 times I gave shows of gladiators under my name, and 5 times under the names of my sons and grandsons. 10,000 men fought in them. Twice I furnished under my name spectacles of athletes gathered from everywhere, 3 times under my grandson's name. So adopting this from the Greeks, essentially, something akin to the Olympic Games. He had 26 times I gave the people hunts of African beasts in the circus, in the open, or in the amphitheater. In them, about 3,500 beasts were killed. This is one of the things that it doesn't really occur to us when we think about ancient Rome, but think about the expense that they had to go through, in order to procure 3,500 lions and rhinos and elephants and other things from the interior of Africa. I mean, it's staggering to consider how much that cost. How many, hunters they had to send out into Africa to find these animals, to trap them, to make sure that they weren't injured, to transport them and care for them, and keep them healthy so that they could be trotted out in some performance space in Rome and slaughtered by hunters for the public's enjoyment. Right? That's incredible that Romans were able to accomplish such things. To give us a sense of the scale of some of these entertainments he provided, number 23 here, I gave the people a spectacle of a naval battle in the place across the Tiber where the Grove of the Caesars is now, with the ground excavated in length 1,800 feet and width 1,200 feet. So we're talking about 6 football fields in length and 4 in width. They excavated a lake in the, just on the outskirts of the city of Rome, and brought in many huge naval ships, and 3,000 men fought on these ships, And the Roman public standing on the shore got to enjoy this. These 3,000 men did not fight a mock naval battle. They really fought to the death. These were almost certainly slaves, the many, many war captives that the Romans still had at their disposal. I assume they may have awarded some of them their freedom or given them some kind of reward if they lived through this. But this was great entertainment for the Romans, who really enjoyed things like this. Let's see, is there any other... I mean, you can look through, and I'd encourage you to read this very carefully. But one of the things that we should say about Augustus is he really just changed the way that everything worked. And the last point that I want to make is he even changed the concept of honor. We talked about how intrinsic, how important honor was to people in Rome during the Republic, such that they were willing to sacrifice greatly in order to obtain honor. Honor was the thing that they passed down from generation to generation within the patrician ranks. This is the thing that really animated Cicero in making the speeches against Catiline that you're assigned for this week. Augustus changed the concept of honor. It used to be that honor was gained through good breeding, good heredity, through inheritance from one's parents and forefathers who had done great things for the Roman Republic. And that still continued to be the case to some extent. But now that Augustus was the one doing almost all of the important things, it was no longer possible to gain honor through those means. And so instead, honor came to be gained and held by virtue of one's relationship with Augustus. The emperor was the source of honor. And if he held someone in contempt, they lost honor. If he showered favors on them, they gained honor. Someone who was proximate to him had tremendous honor. Somebody who was shut out of his presence had no honor. So the very concept of honor changed, and this is one of the cultural features, one of the cultural changes that really came to define the Roman Empire now that we've shifted away from the Republic. In the next lecture, I will talk more in detail about the empire, I should say, the functioning of the empire, the secrets to its success, the things that it was able to do, the limitations it had as well. But now that we've been introduced to the first emperor and spent a good deal of time talking about him, hopefully we have a good sense of where Rome is going here.